Well, History Valley listeners, you guys don't want to miss this. Today I'm bringing together Professor Marcus Vincent of James Stevens Valiant. Professor Vincent bought James Valiant's book on Kindle last time I interviewed him. And today we're going to be talking about what he thinks of James Valiant's book so far.
Okay.
So, Professor Vincent, I pass the mic on to you. Carry the torch. What do you think of it so far?
Well, first of all, James, thanks so much for writing and publishing this book. I would have loved to have known it much earlier. I think I would have done a few things differently, particularly in my last book, which I've just published in January this year, where I have a large section on John the Baptist. I think I would have learned a lot from your book, and I would have written this chapter and these elements a bit differently. Because what I absolutely admire is your take on, let's say, the Roman characterization of and the parallels between Roman central categories and central ethical ideas, and the parallels in the early Christian writings that we have. I particularly saw the parallels that you draw between Josephus and mostly Luke, really. And that's something we might discuss a bit further later in our discussion that we have. I say that because from my own perspective, I saw a number of elements that you outline in this book myself, but I haven't conceptualized in the way you did. And so that was enlightening. And the other thing which I really admired was the richness of the material. I mean, particularly the coinage that you brought together, which is more than just illustration, but which shows the kind of proximity that we have between those Roman, let's say, ideologies and early Christian ideologies. We might also discuss that a bit because you stretch or you place the emphasis on the period of the Flavians and the aftermath of the First Jewish War. But then you also stretch the dating right into the times of Hadrian. And that's another topic which I would like to discuss with you. I've only unfortunately started reading because I managed as much as I could during this 8-day period since I knew your book and today. So I'd be interested also in discussing with you the ways you see the beginnings of those early Christian writings, which together with scholarship you also place firmly into the first century, at least most of the writings, and try to place them firmly in and embed them really into the Roman environment, where I can see a lot of merits. But maybe we can deepen that discussion and see what else one can do. So overall, and to make it short, I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book, which I haven't done, but probably explain a bit what is to be expected from those last 50% of the book. And we may have another conversation about things.
Oh, I think that's a guarantee, yeah.
Well, sir, I want to say thank you very much. I'm deeply honored. I'm very conscious and very self-conscious of the fact that I'm presenting somewhat radical ideas and doing my best to couch it within standard scholarship as much as possible. I'm open-minded, though, about certain elements, and your work and Jacob's certainly pointed me in various directions too for other work that gets me wondering necessarily about certain dates that we just went with because they were the standard dating of certain material. I am open-minded about that, in fact, and become more open-minded about that. It just strikes me too that the documents, the texts that we have in the New Testament are, on the face of it, looking at the 10,000 meter elevation, they appear to be a direct critical response to the Messianic, Torah Orthodox, militant, nationalist rebels who were responsible for the First and Second Jewish Wars, and that it strikes me as something more than merely coincidental that Christianity should emerge right at the same period, roughly at the same period between the wars and around the time of these wars, the exact dating of which I'm flexible about with the documents, but it does strike me as a form of Messianic Judaism that is a direct response. It's using the apocalyptic form, which was surely the genre of our Messianic rebels, but sort of to turn it on its head into a pro-peace, highly spiritualized, deeply Hellenized response to Torah-critical, apocalyptic, militant, Messianic nationalists, because all that other stuff is turned inside out, in effect. And when I see something turned inside out, I have to wonder, this has got to be a critical response to the mainline Jewish messianics of the first 2 centuries.
And I have to say, on that, you have absolutely convinced me. I mean, my attempt in writing early Christian history is likewise a response to the idea that this is a direct, I think, answer to the political history in which these early beginnings of Christianity are embedded. So, like you, I see this kind of attempt for a peaceful, harmonic religion as a direct opposition to what Christians regard as a Jewish form of messianism, of prophetism, and even the entire creation outline. And for that very reason, I mean, we come from 2 different perspectives, but I think there is a broad basis of conversion, where both of our attempts are really systematically complementary.
It just seems to me that even in what are seem to be the earliest Christian texts, the so-called authentic letters of Paul, the main themes are directly addressing extreme sectarianism, which must have characterized the rebels, you know, only Jews and proper Jews, and you have to be circumcised. And Paul is directly addressing the idea of openness and inclusion and assimilation. And sure, it doesn't matter whether you're a Greek or a Jew or a slave or not or a woman or not. And furthermore, if you look at something like Romans 13, it's more than just window dressing to sort of give an appeasing nod to the Romans. The government of Rome appears to be the appointed agents of God on earth. If we read Romans 13, and rebellion is a sin, paying taxes isn't just a good practical idea to get along, not paying taxes is a sin, and the government, even the Roman government, appears to be God's appointed agent on earth. Yeah. That is extreme pro-assimilation, that's extreme pro-peace, pro-Roman politics, it seems to me. And the more I read the letters of Paul, the more I'm convinced that they seem to be, and look, it's not written in Hebrew or Aramaic, it's written in Greek, highly Hellenized. It seems to echo Greek philosophy, it seems to echo Stoicism, which was so popular with the Romans. And yeah, another thing that really struck me, Creating Christ began as, in effect, a monograph I was writing on Roman coinage.
Yeah, that's I mean, shines through.
So when I read, peace on earth, goodwill toward men, is the angelic, Luke's nativity story, the angelic announcement of Jesus' birth, and I see the same exact concepts on Roman coinage. Pax orbis terrarum, or concordia, clementia, mercy, even. These ideas are embedded. Spes, hope. These ideas are fundamentally embedded even in the Pauline lexicon. And that's strange that Luke and Paul should so echo official Roman propaganda that you can find in Roman coinage of the first 2 centuries. I find remarkable.
Yeah. For me, probably Jacob has talked a bit about the work I'm doing and I've done, is I think I try to differentiate between different layers. Yeah. First of all, and here I think it would even play into your hands. Yeah, what I'm doing, because when we look at the gospel material, and I will come to Paul in a second, right? If my views were correct, that the material that we have might not be dated to the first century, because for a variety of reasons. First of all, external evidence is non-existent. So unless the many coins you have, and unless the imageries you have, I mean, you yourself were surprised, yeah, how little so-called definitive Christian iconography can be found in the first 2 centuries. I mean, usually art historians make us believe, and I think they're right, that before the end of the 2nd century, there is no definitive Christian iconography. So all we have is pagan iconography.
And there appears to be this blending in, because the pagan iconography, you can still see dolphins and anchors at the Hagia Sophia centuries later. So it seems to be a continuous tradition of this imagery, which is grounded, if there is any grounding in the 2nd century, these same pagan images.
Yeah, and now if we were to believe that these Gospels were these stories, yeah, were created after the mid-1st century, whether it's 60, 70, 80, whatever, right? To believe that for 120 years nobody picked these imageries up, yeah, and related to them is one question and one problem for all these people who date these texts early. Second major problem is, of course, that all the kind of literature that we read, be it 1 Clement and other writings, yeah, they do not refer to these Gospels. At best, you have from time to time a few sayings of the Lord, yeah? And when we then compare those sayings with our canonical texts, we won't find them.
We won't find them. That's exactly correct.
So that's the big problem. But conversely, when we look into the same texts, we can find writings and quotations from Paul. So that makes a big difference. Yeah. But if we then move to Paul, I would say even with the so-called genuine letters of Paul, there's a big problem. First of all, we don't have copies, no papyrus, external evidence does not exist for the 1st century.
Simply
the very first collection we know of, not that we have it as a manuscript, but at least being described.
I nearly witnessed
the collection that Marcion of Sinope put together. So here we are in the year roughly 144. Yeah. So what I'm doing right now, and that's not a work which I finished, I told Jacob about it, is a comparison from what we've got as witness reports, plus what we've got as variants in New Testament, particularly Pauline manuscripts, which of course are dated from the 3rd century and later.
Yeah.
And the last thing is what I'm also doing, I do a semantic comparison between the texts which are witnessed for Paul in that collection of Marcion and our canonical Paul. And that gives me a great difference between the canonical Paul and the Marcionite Paul. And the kind of redaction that apparently went on between the Marcionite Paul, which might be the older Paul, I'm not saying the authentic one, but it's at least the older text that we got, yeah, where we can date the text, yeah, to roughly before the mid-2nd century. And what we then get as a canonical Paul, that difference is almost exactly the same difference that we have in the development of the Ignatian letters, from the early collection that we have as a 3-letter collection to the 7 letters.
So you don't, yeah, exactly. You don't believe that all 7 letters of Ignatius are authentic to Ignatius?
No. What I've discovered, and I published a book 2 years ago with COP, which is called Writing the History of Early Christianity. And the last chapter, a big chapter, is on the Ignatian letters. Because I rediscovered that already in the 19th century, William Cureton, a Syriologist and a big chap in the UK, published 3 letters from various Syriac manuscripts. And these are much shorter. It's just 1 letter to the Romans, 1 letter to Polycarp, and 1 letter to the Ephesians. A much shorter text, which he believed was authentic, the authentic collection. I'm still doubting whether this is authentic, but at least it's the older collection according to my studies. Because quite quickly, Lightfoot, the big Lightfoot bishop, right, who sided first with Cureton, Lightfoot then made a big case against Cureton and wanted to kill his theory that these 3, he speaks in these terms, right, to kill his theory. He probably would have killed him as well, but he achieved what he wanted, together with the German Theodor Zahn. So these 2 set the stage, and from that time onwards, we did not have publications on the 3 letters again. So ever since the 1880s until today, you only get collections of the 7 letters and studies, hundreds. But I give you just one example. When you compare his letter to the Romans from the 3-letter collection and compare it with the 7-letter collection, almost all the references to Christ are missing in the text of the 3-letter collection. Now, nobody, I think, can make us believe that a pious monk in the 4th century, an ascetic monk, would have redacted the letter to the Romans by taking out references to Christ. It's a nonsensical.
Doesn't make any sense at all, no.
And that's just one amongst many, many arguments you can see that the 3-letter collection predates the 7-letter collection. And this is the way I came then back to Paul, because when I saw what kind of redaction went on to move from let's say a 3-letter collection, which probably dates from around the same time as Marcion's Paul, so roughly from the middle of the 2nd century. And what the redaction then did to these 3 letters in the years 170, where we are about 40 years away from the Second Jewish War, we have very similar ideas that we find in our canonical Paul, that we find in the so-called 7 letters of Ignatius, and in the redaction of the Gospels. So the kind of similarity you find is absolutely extraordinary. And the texts from the early 2nd century or mid-2nd century are pretty different.
Well, that's
so most of the things you refer to, Romans 13, Luke's stories, many, not all, are redactional texts. The birth stories, for example, John the Baptist, the development of John the Baptist's baptizing Jesus, is late 2nd century. And that's interesting that one has about 30-40 years after the Jewish War. One does 2 things. One makes Christianity even more Roman, and at the same time Jewish again.
Right.
That's the interesting thing, that they are blending both. And if I'm not mistaken, with Marcion, we have a chap who explicitly, and for that he is known, has set an opposition, as he says in his preface, which is called Oppositiones, Antitheses, for his New Testament. He is absolutely against any kind of mixture between the new religion, which he sees, and Judaism.
See, that's the distinguishing characteristic of Marcionism, right?
Exactly.
They want to merge all these Jewish elements from this new faith. Right.
Despite the fact that I believe that Marcion comes from a Jewish background, probably from a proselyte background, because Tertullian takes him and discusses with him about proselytism and sees him as a proselyte. But it is quite clear that he wants to have a new form of Judaism, which he then calls for himself for the first time. He calls it Christianity. We don't have the term earlier.
The term earlier, right?
Yeah. And in his preface, he says there is an antithesis between Judaism and Christianity.
Right. A direct antithesis. He sees it as direct antithesis, whereas the more orthodox writers say, no. In fact, we're going to try and integrate as much Judaism, authentic Judaism and Hebrew scripture as we can. Right.
And when you look at his gospel, which is then mirrored by Luke's gospel, I mean, 99% of Marcion's text is word by word in Luke. But what Luke does, he adds the youth stories on which you have worked on so much, yeah, and right. He adds the end and whoever wrote acts later.
That makes a great deal of sense, sir. It really does. And what you've also done, of course, is strip a lot of, especially apologetic-leaning people, will use Ignatius and the full body of Ignatius's work as sort of corroboration. And what you've done is stripped most of that away, our ability to use Ignatius as an early witness.
And even more, and that plays into your hands. When you look at Marcion's gospel, how he starts, he doesn't start with a youth story. He also doesn't start with John the Baptist.
Yeah.
He starts with Rome. He starts in the 15th year of Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was procurator. And Luke, in redacting this text, then adds that it was the time when the tetrarchs were there. And you can see Marcion starts with historical reality, which we can check. Yeah, 15th year of Tiberius, Pilate. And the rest with the tetrarchs. Francois Bourbon, who has written the last big commentary on Luke's gospel, he says, what Luke has written about the tetrarchs is fantasy, because there never were 4 tetrarchs, there were only 3.
Right.
And he mistook the word tetrarch for 4 rulers. So he added one who didn't rule. And you can see from a historically reliable Marcion, we move into fantasy land of canonical redaction. And we have many of these idiosyncrasies. Another thing is that Marcion's gospel, of course, starts in Capernaum, and then Jesus moves to Nazareth in the second episode. Luke inverts that to make Jesus more a type of Galilee. Yeah. So when Jesus then refers in the very first story where he is in Nazareth, in the synagogue, he refers the people to say, well, you would better think about the things which I've done in Capernaum. But Luke starts with that story of Nazareth, and Capernaum comes next. So it's a reference in the wrong place.
Right. It seems out of place. Right.
And that made Matthias Klinghardt for the first time a few years ago thinking that Marcion's gospel is the older text and Luke is a revision of it. In the meantime, he has established that.
That is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. And are you reasonably confident that Luke uses Josephus? I've grown very confident in that.
I have to say, that would be the least surprise to me.
Right.
Because I would have thought of already, I think Marcion is using Josephus. Although, if you look into latest scholarship about Josephus, I mean, everything is in the move. Because there's, I think in the meantime, there's widespread disbelief that the kind of Josephus that we have is the Josephus, at least with regards to the Christian references, James, John the Baptist, and so forth. That this is rewritten stuff because they will not have less redaction done to Josephus as they have done to the Christian texts. Which we can see when we look at Origen. when he writes about the Antiquities, book 18, he says Josephus did not believe in
Not
Christ.
say he was the Christ, right?
Exactly. But that's what today the text says.
We know from Origen that the testimonium has been enhanced, and enhanced sometime between Origen and Eusebius. That's a fact, and it's because I'm confident that Origen was reading Josephus that I know it was so enhanced. It makes sense too, because there appears to be straight Christian doctrine I think would be unlikely from the pen of Josephus in any event, raised on the third day and so forth. That appears to be straight Christian doctrine. On the other hand, something like the James passage, I see really no reason to doubt the James passage. And if that's the case, and most scholars I think are comfortable at least with the John the Baptist reference and the James reference, and that still suggests that Josephus is doing something unusual. He appears to be whitewashing first century messianic figures, the rest of whom are all these madmen and innovators and bad people leading the Jewish people astray. So figures, apocalyptic preachers such as John the Baptist, or movement leaders who oppose the high priesthood, as James appears to be from the James passage, would normally be people that Josephus would be very critical of. And yet he appears to be giving a very positive presentation, both of the Baptist and James, the so-called brother of the aforementioned Christ or something. In which case, and I think I also agree that the James reference in book 20 does seem to imply that there was an earlier reference. Probably a much more neutral reference, but I see no reason to think that it wasn't just as positive as the Baptist and James references were.
I agree with you.
And that would be a striking thing that Josephus seems to be pulling out from the first century the list of first century messianics. The Baptist, Jesus, James have been pulled out for special treatment and whitewashing, which I find itself to be curious.
Well, look, but all three of these people, right, are playing into the hands of Josephus. I mean, it was his political agenda after moving over to the Romans to have people whom he can cite, who he can refer to, who at least who support his political leanings, which he needed. I mean, if you are fed by the emperor, if you are living in the emperor's villa, if you're the court writer for the emperor, which also shows some kind of interest of the emperor to have a smooth going with the Jews.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Why is your main propagandist a Jew?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And when you add to that the clear idea that they're the Flavians as part of their cult, it was clear that their claim to being the Jewish Messiah was an important part of it. Tacitus and Suetonius don't simply say that the Flavians claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. These pagan Roman writers flat out say, oh, the Jews got it wrong. Vespasian and Titus were the authentic Jewish messiahs.
And we know Jews had no problem with that. I mean, Xerxes was in the past seen as a messiah. So messianic figures were not necessarily of Jewish descendants. I mean,
right.
This is quite clear.
It's astonishing. I mean, even in Hebrew texts, Cyrus the Great is referred, maybe the earliest one in Hebrew literature, referred to as the Messiah. So that's fascinating in itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I think we have a too pious view of the Messian of the Messiah figure.
Right. So it seems plain to me from Josephus and references from Tacitus and Suetonius that the Roman government was officially using Messianic Judaism for its own propagandistic purposes.
Precisely.
To what extent is still an open question, I think. But when you look at the politics of the New Testament texts, it's somewhat striking. But adding to the idea that, I mean, it seems to me that Josephus doesn't give us any hint, for example, that John the Baptist was an apocalyptic preacher. The Gospels do give us this. You know, the axe will be laid, the wheat will be separated from the chaff, and the chaff will be put on the fire. And so it seems to be very fiery, violent, apocalyptic language, which would suggest that a historical John the Baptist was, in fact, an advocate of rebellion against Rome. And if that's the case, then he's being flipped around by Josephus who just turns it into sort of a neutral, he turns it into a sort of the love commandments and a very neutral sort of much more standard mainline Jewish message that the Baptist, he doesn't give us a hint of the apocalyptic message that the Gospels bleed through with the Baptist, which would suggest to me that these probably were rebel figures, John the Baptist and James and Jesus. Why would Jesus be crucified? The Romans clearly, I mean, if the Jews wanted to do it, they could have stoned him. A crucified Jesus suggests that at least the Romans perceived him as a rebel. If that's the case, if for example, I know again that this is sort of on the edge scholarship, but if Brandon and Eisenman are correct that the authentic Jesus is a rebel Jesus, then we're also confronted with an amazing thing. This rebel movement, in effect, has been turned on its head by the text's early Christians.
But I think, if I'm not mistaken, they are turned on its heads in not only once but twice, because if I'm not mistaken, Marcion is doing a very similar job to Josephus. He's trying to whitewash. He's trying to moderate the Christian movement away from a rebel movement to a harmonious, peaceful movement. He inserts, if he has not invented them, but he inserts the Beatitudes. He starts, as I said, in his opening of the gospel, he starts with Rome. And Rome is the positive environment where this Jesus movement is being embedded. He makes clear that John the Baptist, and that would fit your imagery of John the Baptist as a rebel. He then introduces John the Baptist, but only in chapter 16, where he says, the past was the law and the prophets that lasted until John the Baptist, including him. So that's the past. And from that time onwards, we have Jesus. But the law and the prophets lasted no longer than John the Baptist. So the past was seen as a creation of at least a not very powerful God, whose prophets and whose messiahs were violent, including John the Baptist. And against this set of a inconsistent and violent religious past, which culminated in those two revolutions against the Romans, Marcion tries to whitewash, and he takes, like Josephus, but he doesn't take John the Baptist. He puts John the Baptist on the violent side, but he picks
aware, right? He's too aware that he's a well-known rebel, right?
And he picks Jesus as the figure on whom he relies to create the imagery with this biography and Paul's letters, the imagery of a peaceful movement. However, as I show in this book, which I've just published in January, I show that Marcion has great difficulties with some passages of the text that he produces in his gospel. And Tertullian picks those out and makes a laughingstock of the author. Because Marcion has a big problem when there is the word that Jesus hasn't come to bring peace, but the sword.
Right.
He divides families and so forth, right?
Right.
And I can see that this chap apparently, despite his ideology of peace, which runs through the gospel, still embeds these texts, tries to moderate them and tries to interpret them in a different way. But he doesn't really achieve that. So we can see that there was a stock apparently of traditions which were not harmonious, peaceful Jesus, But in his texts, at least he tries to do that. Now what happens is, if I'm not mistaken, and if Marcion's account is correct, which is given in Tertullian, others of the same time, whose names were given then apostles' names and apostolic names, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they reversed that whitewashing. And like Matthew, and you quote quite a number of these passages, and reintroduce a more Jewish-oriented Jesus, at the same time a more apocalyptic Jesus, a violent Jesus, a harsh Jesus. And we can see the difference, for example, the redactor who revised Marcion's gospel, which then became Luke's gospel, has barely any hostility to Jews, in contrast to Matthew. But when it comes to the book of Acts, you have all the hostility there. That's why I cannot believe that the same person has written those two texts. On the contrary, I think what I believe is that the person who has written or is behind Acts is also a major mind behind the canonical reduction of what then becomes the canonical New Testament later.
Fascinating. There is no question that the gospel writers are backing away sort of from the radical Pauline message and steps, right? Matthew is no doubt stepping back into a more Jewish, more historicizing, and everything is based on Hebrew literature. Jesus only came for the Jews. We're couching him in a distinctly non-Marcionite way. It's almost as though Matthew is reacting to a Marcionite Paul vision, right?
What I think, however, is that this early beginnings of this Jesus movement in the 2nd century was less anti-Semite or anti-Jewish as one would think when you take the canonical text as a 1st century text set. But if my explanation were correct, then it doesn't start as an anti-Jewish movement, but it starts as a pro-Roman, accommodating Jewish movement.
What a wonderful distinction that is.
Which then
just pause there to say what a wonderful distinction that is. Because, the Jewish elites who were working with the Romans were not starting out by saying, oh, look, I'm not, Josephus doesn't deny, I'm still a good Jew. I'm going over to the Romans, he says, but I'm still a good Jew. And I have to believe that was the original impulse, rather than being as anti-Semitic, say, as we do get in, the Gospel of John or in the book of Acts. Those books seem to be nakedly anti-Semitic in some ways.
And look at Justin when he says, you Jews, you do not understand your own scriptures, and the scriptures really belong to us. This kind of supersessionism that develops after 150, 60.
That does seem to be logically it would imply, it seemed to be a later doctrine. Yeah.
And it may have been a historical reason for that. Because I do think these Jesus people were still on the side of Bar Kokhba. Because when Bar Kokhba complains, and Justin then says that he even miserably treated, probably even killed Jews who were Jesus Jews, because they didn't side with him. So the expectation, I think, was that Christians would still support the revolt. And I think later on, the kind of harsh hostility which we have in Justin even asking the emperor to kill the Marcionites, to kill people who are siding with the Romans.
Go ahead and kill them.
He's doing that, right?
Right.
And also being hostile to Jews. That comes, and you only need to read the 7-letter collection of Ignatius. Only in the 4 letters, which do not exist in the older collection, you have the anti-Judaisms.
Fascinating.
Only in those 4 letters.
That is just fascinating. And that makes perfect sense. We have Tacitus writing it around the year 120, and for him, Nero could totally put the scapegoat blame for the Great Fire of 64 on Jesus Christ's movement. In other words, Romans were perceiving the Jesus movement, these Christiani, as the rebels, even around 120 when Tacitus was writing.
I even think because it's the mob which makes those claims against those revolutionaries, right? I think it was the people rather than the emperor. I mean, the emperor probably didn't know about the intricacies of the Jews, but I think it was certainly the mob. And it is interesting archaeologically that early Christians lived in these areas of the Circus Maximus, in the Jewish areas. So we have one big group of people, and I've always thought, who amongst the Romans, I mean the public Romans, yeah, who would complain about people having a different sort of cultic belief? They were not interested. They're multicultural in a sense, right? But of course, the closer you get your Jewish neighbors and friends, yeah, they are quite skeptical.
They're going to care, right?
I've told that story before, because when I did Jewish studies in Paris, I had a fantastic teacher, Kurt Ruby. Kurt Ruby was an Austrian. He survived the Holocaust only because his mother put him into a Catholic family. So he was brought up a Catholic, became a Catholic priest, and on the day of his ordination, that was the last day when he saw his diocese, because it was the moment he discovered he was a Jew. And so he became the most radical Jewish professor I've ever seen in Paris. And on a Friday evening, Erev Shabbat, usually accompanied him to his synagogue. And at some point, he started spitting. And I thought, he's an old man, right? But after a while, I asked him and said, Professor, why do you spit? And he says, well, the law says, when you walk past a pagan temple, you have to spit. But we were in the Marais, and we walked from one Orthodox synagogue to the next. But he was spitting in front of all these Orthodox synagogues until we reached his.
Wow.
And that explains to me some kind of relation amongst Jews and Christian Jews in Rome of the times of Nero. I think you only see your own orthodoxy as a religious, and you see the rest as a pagan world, even if it's the most, for us, 10,000 meters high, right, the most orthodox right, Jewish environment.
Right. This stunning observation. Yeah, I have to say I'm deeply impressed by the kind of work you're doing. Fascinating stuff, because if what you're suggesting is true about Ignatius, then most of the apologetic purposes to which Ignatius is deployed by scholars is just misbegotten. The entire effort is misbegotten.
I think it is. And what's also interesting, people have always noticed that Christian apologetic literature starts in the times of Hadrian, not before. We don't have any apology earlier that we know. And one has to explain it. It is, of course, the end of the Second Jewish War.
You know, the more I look at it too, the more I realize that a dating of Paul's letters to the 50s just doesn't make more sense than a late first century, at least, dating of Paul's authentic epistles.
You will see when you see the difference between the two versions, on which I'm just working at the moment. But you can also simply have a look at Jason Bedouin, the first New Testament, I think it is called, where he has already done an English, at least an English version of the Marcionite Paul. So you get an idea. It's not fully accurate, but I mean, mine will also not be fully accurate. But he has done a fantastic job already to give us an insight into an earlier Paul. Yeah, so that's one thing. But to also support your argument again, if we look into the first apology that we have, that we know of at least, right? That's Aristides from Athens. He categorizes for the first time in the late times of Hadrian, probably Antoninus Pius. So again, the same time. He categorized the world into 3 or 4 races. So he says the barbarians or the Egyptians, he's got the Greeks, the Jews, and Christians. Now it's interesting, he doesn't have the Romans, because he thinks they're all Romans. So the Romans are no entity as separate from all.
They're all Romans, right?
Christians are Romans. Yeah, so that's undisputed.
That's fascinating. That is simply fascinating. The Romans are invisible because we are the Romans. Exactly. That's lovely. Yeah. That's really.
And these apologies are written, of course. I mean, whether fictitiously or in reality, we don't know, but are addressed to the Roman emperors. So not to speak of the Romans was quite clear, because they wanted to have to be siding with. So it's the Christians who are the Romans who write to Roman emperors.
Fascinating. I see no way to really object to that model of looking at things. It seems to me obviously the most persuasive way of approaching it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's why your view is so important to me, because it explains for the first time why, for example, people like Marcion or Ignatius, likewise, or Aristides, or a number of others, have simply taken for granted that what they are doing is a kind of new form of religion, which is compatible with Rome.
Right, exactly.
It's still a Jewish form. I mean, it's got monotheistic ideas, but it is different in that it absorbs Rome. And that's why it also absorbs all the cultural iconography and the main thinking and the Stoic ethics and so forth.
Exactly. And so, wow, this has been, I have to say, this has been a fascinating conversation to me. Your work is absolutely fascinating. There's no question about it. Jacob, I absolutely hope that we can continue to have this dialogue.
Oh yeah, of course.
Because it is just so absolutely interesting to me. Where would you place the dating of? I mean, I don't want to pin you down too hard, but how would you date the Gospels, roughly speaking?
It's quite easy to state that, because we know from all sources that we have that Marcion, in the wake of the aftermath of the Second Jewish War, moved to Rome, at least temporarily. And together with him, we have all the rest of these so-called important Christian teachers moving into Rome. And in fact, we don't know of any Christian teacher of whom we have writings and names who were there prior to the end of the Second Jewish War. So, I mean, whether you take Clement of Alexandria or anybody who talks about it, first Christians who move into Rome to teach and to develop classrooms and so forth is at the end of the Second Jewish War. That includes Justin and a few others.
So that would place even Mark at around the time of the Second Jewish War.
Precisely. So what happens is that Tertullian tells us a story that Marcion, in his preface, which was called the Antitheses, the opposite, that he complains in his preface of this published New Testament about 4 plagiarisms, 2 of apostles, and which were given the names of apostles, and 2 which were given the names of students of apostles. Which means these, and if there are plagiarisms, right, so they have based their writings on a pre-form of what was then Marcion's gospel. So if Marcion brought or wrote his gospel in Rome or brought it from Asia Minor to Rome, then that document is datable to about 135 to 138. The canonical gospels then would have been written between that time and the publication of Marcion's New Testament, which was in 144. So about 8 to 10 years we have for these texts to be written. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I said to Jacob last week already, if we place those 4 Gospels, which are the closest we have to Marcion's text, so very different from other Gospels like Peter or Thomas, if we have these 4 texts as almost synoptic texts, we know they must have derived their information from manuscripts. And so it makes much more sense, and Occam's razor kicks in here, that it is easier in a city like Rome, where people knew each other, particularly people of the same mind and spirit, to have access to manuscripts, which are expensive, not easy to get, not easy to travel with, and so forth. It is much easier as a picture than to envisage that these gospel writers wrote 30 years apart around the Mediterranean. And if you square that with the observation that before Marcion publishes his text in 144, not a single author that we can quote knows of any of these stories. I've said to some colleagues, I mean, how can I envisage that only people who write gospels read gospels and quote each other, and nobody else around ever quotes these texts? So how stupid, I mean, impossible, historically impossible. So the further you stretch the dating, and the further you stretch the geography within which these texts were created, the bigger the burden is for your argument. And it's so much easier to envisage that these people wrote in close contact. And one more argument for that. For the last 200 years, New Testament scholars have not made up their minds about 2 sources, 4 sources, who derived it from whom, Q, yes or no. And I predict in the next 500 years, they will not come to a unanimous conclusion. This is not because they are stupid or they are obstructive. No, the problem is it's the wrong question. If you think in genealogies, A derived from B or C from B, that's wrong. What I think is right is, like with the manuscripts we have, these texts were written in such proximity that we are having cross-contamination. So what Matthew wrote, Luke knew. What Mark wrote, Matthew knew, and John knew as well. And we can see it, if it is correct that Tertullian states that Marcion, when he published his texts, took criticism of these other 4 texts. That is what I mean with cross-contamination, which means the text that we have as Marcion's gospel is already contaminated by these other 4 gospels. And so it's no surprise that we have a bundle of wool which we can no longer distinguish.
Separate out. Right. See, the standard view is that Matthew is a reaction to Mark, and that today, or that Luke, the good anchor, Luke is a reaction to Matthew, and that John is a reaction to the whole synoptic tradition.
But you can see with the so-called minor stuff, the whole thing is more complex, it's more intimate. And that's why I think proximity is the answer to that, and cross-contamination.
The fascinating thing is, given the clear evidence of redaction, and boy, do we have clear evidence of continuous redaction, there appears to be, in other words, it doesn't seem to be a straight line that we can draw. There appears to be interaction at every stage, so that the form in which we have the Gospels appear to be, as you say, interactive with the others in a way that makes it actually difficult and challenging to separate the material out.
Just mentioned last week, I just mentioned Papias of Hierapolis.
See, he appears to know.
There's one fragment which is only preserved in Latin in the prefaces to the Western Bible on John's Gospel, and there we have explicitly the report that there was an interaction between Marcion and John about gospel writing.
Right, and then Mark is in Italy.
Yeah, and well, as you can see, Marcion, not Mark, Marcion and John. Yeah. So the editors of this fragment have deleted Marcion's name and replaced it by others without basis in the manuscripts, because they said it can't be that John writes as late as Marcion. But I think that's exactly what happens. It is the relation which even is present in our texts, which show that, and now coming back to your question, that these texts have been created in a time span of about 8 years. They're all Roman texts, and that's why the Roman environment is so important.
Papias seems to be aware of Mark and Matthew.
Look, if Rome as a city has such a diverse population of Jews and Jewish Christians, you would have, of course, people who are more Jewish, like Matthew, and therefore anti-Jewish at the same time. You have more people like Marcion, and then Luke's Gospel, which is more a Greco-Roman form of Jesus' document. Yeah, you have more a Gnosticizing form of Jesus people, and we know of Gnostic catacombs in Rome. So you would have people like the John people and these teachings, yeah. And you would have like people like Justin Martyr, who doesn't care about the gospel text at all, talks about memories of apostles and never speaks about Paul. So these are all in one city.
I think that is a very persuasive way of looking at it, because that's, I think, the way we have to look at the early Christian community. It is a diverse part of the Roman Jewish population, given their philosophical perspective, their take on their own culture and tradition. It's plain that these are assimilative Jews of various kinds working in proximity to one another.
And that's why Josephus plays such a role for them, because he is, of course, the master narrative for all these groups, yeah? Because they live in Rome, they earn money with the government, they earn money from a
so it wouldn't
normal life.
If Josephus were found to be an influence on all of the gospel writers.
All of them.
Fascinating, because that's exactly...
Because, I mean, we don't have many authors to whom these writers could refer to. Of course, it's Philo, and of course...
Philo, Josephus, yeah.
I published a book 2 years ago about, which now is going to be published with Cambridge University Press, resetting the origins of Christianity.
Congratulations.
And yeah, and there I go retrospectively from the medieval period backwards towards the 2nd century, and I'm only asking 2 questions. First of all, which kind of a picture do they paint about the beginnings of Christians? And the second answer, or the second question I'm raising, is which kind of sources do they use? And I start with Gregory of Tours and go through Orosius and come to Eusebius and go further until Tertullian. Just to stick with one, Eusebius, whom you know so well. When he writes in his first 2 books, the beginnings of the Christian movement, he hardly makes use of canonical literature. The major sources that he uses are 3. Josephus, and the many times he quotes Josephus, he might say, oh, you can find similar things in Luke or in Acts. Second source is Philo of Alexandria. And the third source, for him, the most important Christian source, and the only Christian source that he uses, is the letter exchange between Jesus and Abgar, which he himself says he found in the archives of Odessa. He translated from Syriac into Greek. And this is the entire message from which he constructs the first 2 centuries of Christians. Now, that's quite interesting.
That is.
And it shows, and then when he talks about the Gospels, he's already deeply in the 3rd book, where he also quotes Papias of Hierapolis. But that is when he talks about the Hadrianic period.
He's already started in on his 2nd century narrative. By the time the Gospels come up for him.
Exactly.
Right.
That's where the writings appear.
That is absolutely fascinating observation, too. You would have thought he would have had some earlier reference to the synoptics and the origins of the Jesus story. Right.
And I think the way he writes is the way people thought. It is Josephus and Philo, which is our earliest tradition. And that's the blueprint.
In fact, what you're saying is that Philo and Josephus is the earliest layer of what we call Christianity. Right.
That's still the blueprint for Eusebius.
Oh, that's fascinating. Oh, wow.
That's why I was so fascinated reading your chapter on Josephus.
I see, right. Now that I see the intimate connections between our work, we have to have more of these conversations, Jacob.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I got stuck with this chapter, because I couldn't read on, because I needed to read every sentence, and I couldn't jump over just to get a sense of the book.
Jacob has been pulling me and pulling me and pulling me in two directions. A late dating of Paul, a late dating indeed of the documents. I've been, of course, steadfastly resisting as best as I could, but he's dragging me there, kicking and screaming against my will, to a later date, which I'm finding it simply makes better sense. You know, the traditional historical hooks in the authentic Pauline epistles, Aretas or something, are just simply not as strong as, say, references in Philippians to
I made this. Yeah,
Epaphroditus.
I remember talking about the Aretas thing. My issue with that is, and Dr. Vincent, I would love to send my material to you on Paul. Um, I'm gonna send that material to you as soon as possible. Um, when Paul states that he was fleeing from Aretas, he's on a basket, and it immediately occurred to me. It reminded me of Moses.
His friends
When he was being put on a place on a basket to flee from Pharaoh. I was like, oh, come on. This is this so a full-grown man running from Aretas on a basket. I'm just no way. And the other thing that bothered me is Galatians.
Yeah.
Galatians, when Paul makes a very odd statement, Jesus chose me before I was born. Now, one could argue, well, it could be because Jesus chose Paul's soul before he came down to earth or something like that, which I don't buy. But if you combine that with the Aretas reference in 2 Corinthians, I came to what some might consider to be a radical conclusion, that Paul was not a contemporary of Jesus, but he was born a few years after Jesus' crucifixion. And that he was a baby around 37 AD. His family was fleeing from Aretas.
Could be chosen before there. I mean, the doctrine of the elect, right? So there is
Well, the thing is, we're already saying Paul didn't meet Jesus. Or at least
the tradition is clear.
There's no evidence that he met Jesus.
And what's interesting about Galatians,
it wouldn't make much of a difference if if I were right. And the thing is, Professor Eisenman makes an argument that I think is convincing that Paul is related to the Herods. In Romans 16:11, it states that greetings, my kinsman Herodian. And Josephus says, when Phasaelus, the daughter of Aretas, when Herod Antipas divorced her, around late 36 AD, King Aretas IV gets really mad, and by early 37, he attacks Jerusalem. It's like he's really angry at Herod Antipas for what he had done. And he kind of put, if you toss Paul in that situation, he's fleeing from Aretas on the basket. Jesus chose me before I was born.
You know, the whole mess starts with Acts.
Mm-hmm.
Acts is positioning Paul. And 90% of what we've got in our head is not Paul, but Acts.
Exactly.
I mean, Ignatius goes further. He says, if I read Acts, I also can read Paul, which explains it quite clearly. So the Paul that we have is the Acts Paul, right? And that creates dating, that creates stories and relations.
I don't think we can line up the chronology in Acts with the chronology that Paul seems to present in his letters.
That's why when I was bringing up just real quick the epistles, yeah. I was leaving out Acts in that.
Right.
But
in Galatians, he claims to have had a confrontation with Cephas, and he apparently he claims that at some point his freedom in Christ is being spied out by James, who appears to be the leader of the movement. This is suggested that he knew at some point. Now, when Galatians was written is different than when this argument happened. So he may have had the argument around 60, but the letter may not have been written until 30 years later for what we know. But the standard argument goes that since he knew Jesus's brother, and since he knew Jesus's top friend, maybe Cephas, that puts him in the first century for sure. Now, when that puts him is not entirely clear. The tradition is, well, Galatians was written shortly after he had this conflict. It does appear to be a fiery, angry letter in which he's condemning the previous leaders of the movement. But wouldn't that make better sense after the movement has collapsed and the Jewish war has already happened, and he's there to, after the dust is settled, sort of to take over, as opposed to writing it right then when James and Cephas were in their leadership roles in the rebel movement. And more than that, when you have references like in Philippians to Epaphroditus and Clement and so forth, and figures who may even be second century figures, you're convincing me that it makes more sense in a late first century setting.
I remember I brought some of those points up to Dr. Vincent last time. The Flavius Archippus there was a German scholar in the 19th century that made the case that Flavius Archippus is the same guy called Archippus in Paul's letters, or the so-called Paul's letters.
Very hard for Paul to be writing in the mid-first century.
Right.
But look, these passages are missing in the Marcionite Paul, in the earlier Paul, I think. These passages are entirely part of the canonical reduction.
They were placed in there to place it in first century.
And the same happens in the Ignatian letters. So you're plastering these older letters with names, and these names then connect. And when you look, for example, in Romans 15 and 16, which is missing in Marcionite Paul, just like 1 Corinthians 16, which is missing, it is these chapters, or like what you were saying about Philippians and so forth. So it is these chapters which make these connections between the redactional parts, which are late second century, and the earlier letters, to create the imagination that Acts and these Pauline letters somehow hang together. But in reality, I think it is a canonical way of redacting stuff together, which creates then the new collection around Irenaeus, which then later becomes our canonical New Testament.
That is a fascinating way of looking at it. So the names were placed there precisely in order to give it first century provenance.
Exactly.
So
I was speaking at a conference in April in Manchester on letter forgery. And because they have a whole big project of antique letter writing. And this time the question is forgery. Forgery not in a negative sense necessarily, but in a redactional, in a development sense.
Right.
And you can clearly see, as we can see in Ignatius, each time when new letters were added to a collection, the old letters were substantially revised. So it was not just bolting on, as New Testament scholars tell us. We have pseudo-Paulines, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, which have simply been added to existing authentic letters. No, the process always is, or mostly is, that when you add new letters, you make them fit to the old set of letters. Hence, you revise the old letters in the light of the new ones. And the same happened when the pastoral letters were added. For example, the stuff on homosexuality is being added to Romans and added to 1 Corinthians. And before the addition in 1 Corinthians, there is also a name being placed into 1 Corinthians, which is both all missing in Marcion's collection, namely that we should refer and trust Timothy, who is saying the same thing as Paul believes should be said. And then comes the controversial sentence against the homosexuals. But it's a parallel which you can read in Timothy. So you get the sense as a reader of this canonical set that Paul was always saying what's being said. But
right.
It's late second century.
Exactly.
When would you date the so far? Because I know this is in progress right now. When would you date the original pre-Marcionite Pauline epistles? Or what would you lean towards?
Well, at the moment, I think that the text of Marcion's collection of Paul's letters, that we can date. That dates to around 140, 44, But as these texts are already, as I said last week, it seems to me they are already so much redacted by the person Marcion himself, because James, you will not be surprised, or you will be surprised. I was surprised at least the same kind of semantics, grammar, style is across Paul's letters and Marcion's gospel. So they have such coherence in the semantics that you can see these two texts derived from the same person, whether it's Marcion or somebody earlier, I don't know. But if it is that the case, then the version of what he relied, and I do think he relied on something, because otherwise these letters would have been more infected by the narratives of the gospel.
So basically, you're suggesting, I didn't mean to cut you off, James. I just want to get this question in just real fast. You're basically suggesting it doesn't matter. Both collections are 2nd century CE.
Yes.
And therefore, basically, the historical Paul didn't write anything.
No, I do think he wrote something, because
very little.
Right, but how do we extract
let's put it that way. If Marcion had simply, like Shakespeare, drafted those letters and the gospel, there would be more interchange between the two sets of texts, I think. And it isn't. There's little overlap. I mean, you have the Eucharist and you have a few things, but there's too little overlap. So I think both go back to a stock of material. I think on the gospel, rather oral material. In the letters, probably more written material. But it can't be too much, because otherwise the text wouldn't be so similar.
Right.
So
So it's difficult to extract, but we can know that it's just a fragment, a small bit
ideas, probably. I don't know.
Right.
So basically, the majority of the material in what is called the 7 authentic letters of Paul isn't so authentic.
You put it at a very good point. Which doesn't mean that it didn't exist, but but the stock. I mean, this is something where we have to work towards the future. First, we need to do a thorough reconstruction, and then we need to see, like with the gospel, what goes against, for example, Marcion in what he reports. And there are quite a number of things which go against his views.
Right.
He tries to explain things.
And that would be the best way to extract it.
Yeah.
Right, but we may be left with a small handful of
crumbs.
Or a more valuable one.
Right.
Because we can contextualize it better.
That is exciting work, sir. That is exciting work you're doing.
Yeah. But it needs this kind of contextualizing which you do. So it's exactly that.
Thank you very much. I will follow your work with great interest, sir, because obviously our work overlaps considerably.
Yeah.
As I say, I'm being persuaded all the time to later and later datings of this material. It seems strange to me in any event that when we're given a dating range, how scholars will always push it to the early dating.
Well, I said to Jacob, I mean, this is, I mean, I'm not the first one, but that is the romantic attempt, right, to bridge the gaps.
That's it. We want it to be as close in time, to link up, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, I see the First Jewish War, and especially the Second Jewish War, as a giant break. What's clearly happening is the standard messianic rebel movement is falling apart. It's collapsing, in effect, and clearing the way, in effect, for Christianity to sort of redirect messianic Jewish thinking in their own direction. Not to say it's completely wiped out. It's just driven underground, and their big organization has been shattered, so that Paul can come along and say, well, James and Cephas, well, they were I don't care what pillars, I don't care who people call them somebodies, people call them pillars, I don't care who they were. And it seems to me far more likely in a post-war environment that you could even get away with saying something like that. In a pre-war environment, James and Cephas are still ruling the roost, in effect. And
that's why these texts, if these texts existed at all, but if these texts
at all,
to
the extent that they even existed, it seems to me that it makes more sense.
They resurface exactly at that time.
Right. A post-war environment seems to make a lot more sense.
Your conclusions, Professor Vincent, make the most sense to me. With James Valiant's conclusion added to that, you both meld perfectly, in my view. Yeah. And because on my channel, it's always been one or the other. I get a scholar on that says Paul wrote in the 50s, Jesus existed, and or I get this other person that says he's a mythicist. Say, oh, Jesus didn't exist, but Paul's letters are after the Jewish war, all forgeries or something like that. And it's like, no, I think Jesus existed. New Testament's dated too early, and a while back I did persuade a not so well known academic, Brian Allen, that there's something wrong with the dating of Paul's letters. And I really haven't had somebody on my channel that sees that also believes Jesus existed until you came along. I think your views make a lot of sense to me. They really do.
Not so much, yeah.
Well, I think that one can be a historicist and still have a late dating to the document.
Exactly. Because I've heard some. There's one person that told me it was Paul George. He was trying to tell me that because he dates the letters after 80/70, he says I don't see how Jesus could exist without late dating. I'm like, and I was trying to explain to him, I don't that that way of thinking doesn't make much sense to me. Like, just because the letters may date later does not tell you Jesus exists or not. What I don't
The,
agree with that view.
both Paul and the Gospels seem to be wrestling with a difficult fact, a
Yeah,
crucifixion. And Paul is perfectly vague about the powers of this age that did Jesus in. Why is he being so vague? And then the Gospels seem to be doing something extraordinary. Um, if they had wanted to say, let's say you want to invent a Jesus from scratch and you want to blame the Jews and the Jewish authorities for it, you could have simply had them stone Jesus. It seems to me that we have a fact of crucifixion that they're having a hard time wrestling with. And it would suggest that the Romans at least perceive Jesus as a rebel, but the Gospels very much want to portray Jesus as not a rebel. And so they're having to. Bart Ehrman himself, in our conversation a couple of weeks ago, conceded that the Passion narrative is fiction in all four Gospels, and that it is clear allegory designed to exonerate the Romans and blame the Jews for what apparently is a Roman execution, crucifixion. And if you have someone like Bart Ehrman himself saying, yeah, the Passion narrative shared by all four Gospels is itself fictional allegory designed to blame the Jews for what appears to be a Roman execution, then I think we're stuck with a historical crucifixion, one that Christians themselves were wrestling with as a problem. And this makes me lean heavily in the direction of historicism these days. Does that make sense?
And you can see that, for example, Pilate's the best image, so the most positive image you have in Luke's Gospel, which is a one-to-one copy at this place of Marcion's text, whereas the others then are more problematic with Pilate. So I do think that it was the attempt, and that shows me a stock of historicity here. Yeah,
Yeah.
If Marcion had been just a Shakespeare, he would have conceived of a different sort of Christ. Christ certainly not getting into muddle with politics, not being killed for being a rebel. It would have been another story which he could have developed, but he doesn't. Yeah,
He doesn't.
He sticks to this kind of oral tradition which he has dug out and which makes him heartbeat sometimes. Yeah,
Yeah.
like with Paul.
Yeah.
He's
Our
moved
second century
edges as much
study.
as he can.
Makes sense to me.
He derives Christ not from birth, so like a middle Platonic divinity. He falls from heaven and well, just disappears at the end. Yeah, so it's
Very Platonic.
it is his attempt to show that history doesn't matter, but he does so by using history.
Of course.
And this is the way to live with Rome. It is showing that this type of religion is a Roman religion where Rome doesn't play the most important part and doesn't make sense. It is beyond it. And in that type, I think Augustine picked this idea greatly because he acknowledges this kind of earthly environment by attempting to transcend it. And the interesting thing is, with all four Gospels, including John, we have a rehistoricizing of the story. and it becomes a Bethlehem story, and it becomes at the end a story which was never meant to be a historical story, but an anti-historical story. But if I'm not mistaken, Marcion has used history because that was the stock which he derived too by
So
his
we have his history, allegorical retelling of history, and then a rehistoricizing of the allegory.
That's how I see it.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I think that is the most persuasive way of looking at this development. Yeah.
I'm also saying the first century is still up to now like a black box. So mostly people bring their ideas into it rather than taking things out.
But
it's so difficult to take things out because we know so little.
Put. People are jamming into the first century what they want jammed into the first century, in effect, without much basis at all.
Yeah.
Without much basis at all.
Or they, as Jacob says, or they clear the box from anything, which I think is as great a mistake as the other.
Right. And that's the mythicist error, is they clear it entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, you have a really outstanding conceptual framework on this literature, sir. No question about it. It makes a lot of sense, and it seems to answer, the anomalies that we find in the literature, and I think you've found a good way of explaining them with this. Now, well, thank you very much for this conversation, sir. My gosh, how exciting. This is one of the most exciting conversations I've had recently. Thank you very, very much.
Well, but also thank you to Jacob and yourself, drawing the attention to this book and to your work, because I have to revise this book which I published in January, which is called Christ's Torah. And that's being published with O.R.D in Germany. But I'm negotiating at the moment with a British publisher to get it published in English.
In English, hey!
And I tell you, it will look very different because I will make use of your literature, and it will change a good deal of it.
Wow. Well, then obviously our engagement.
Because I really got the key
productive. I'm excited about the productive engagement that we can engage in, sir. So
because what is quite clear, we have colleagues who have drawn parallels and seen a lot of stuff, parallels between Josephus, iconography, and all the rest of it. But I haven't come across one work like yours which puts a Roman perspective on these texts. And I think that is absolutely vital.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Wow. Unfortunately, I do have another podcast later today, and so I do have to break away now. But
no problem.
This has been a very exciting, I have to say, this is a very, very exciting moment for me, and I'm glad we finally...
Yeah, me too. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you.
Definitely. We got to reconvene sometime soon.
Indeed.
Pleasure.
Take